What they pulled from the permafrost in 2010 should have been impossible. A child's body, preserved for nearly 45,000 years in the frozen soil of western Siberia, still wearing its burial clothes of antler beads and bird bones. The geneticists who sequenced her DNA expected the usual markers of early modern humans migrating out of Africa. Instead, they found something that made them run the test 3 times. The girl had red hair, not the faded reddish-brown that sometimes appears in ancient remains due to oxidation. Real genetic MC1R-driven red hair with a specific variant R160W that today is almost exclusively found in Ireland and Scotland. The scientists sat in stunned silence. This child had lived and died in Siberia, thousands of miles from any known Celtic population, 20,000 years before the first humans set foot on the British Isles. The Ice Age had been at its maximum. Glaciers a mile thick covered what is now Germany, Poland, and most of Scandinavia. The land bridge connecting Britain to Europe didn't even exist yet. And here, in the frozen heart of Asia, was a red-haired child whose closest genetic relatives today live on the Atlantic coast of Ireland. The discovery shattered everything researchers thought they knew. For decades, the standard story had been simple and comfortable. Red hair evolved in Europe after the last ice age, probably among the Celtic peoples, as an adaptation to cloudy northern skies. The MC1R mutations were recent, maybe 10,000 to 20,000 years old, and spread through founder effects and sexual selection in isolated island populations. But a Siberian girl, whom scientists named Ust-Ishim after the region where she was found, carried a red hair variant that was already fully formed when Neanderthals still walked the earth. That meant the genetic machinery for red hair was not a late addition to the human genome. It was ancient, far more ancient than anyone had imagined. The implications were staggering, and they only grew more disturbing as more ancient genomes were sequenced. If red hair variants existed in Siberia during the Ice Age, they must have been carried there by populations moving across the frozen continents. And those populations had to have come from somewhere. The only possible source was the same small group of humans who had recently expanded out of Africa and into the unknown world, which meant that the potential for red hair, the raw genetic possibility of copper and flame-colored hair, had been present in the human species from its earliest days outside the tropics. It just hadn't been expressed, or hadn't been favored, until certain populations found themselves in certain environments. But Ust-Ishim was only the beginning of the horror, only the first crack in the comfortable story. In 2014, a team working in the mountains of western China, the same region where the Darim mummies had been found decades earlier, made an even more disturbing discovery: a burial site containing the remains of a young man who had died around 4,000 years ago. His hair was perfectly preserved, long and braided, and it was a deep, unmistakable auburn. Genetic analysis showed he carried the MC1R variant R151C, another variant today associated strongly with red hair in Ireland and Scotland. But this man wasn't European in the modern sense. He was Tocharian, part of an Indo-European-speaking population that had migrated eastward across the steppes during the Bronze Age. The Tocharians had red hair, not as a rare anomaly, but as a common trait. Ancient texts from China describe them as tall, with deep-set eyes, prominent noses, and hair that ranged from blonde to deep red. The Chinese called them the Yuezhi, and later the Kushans, and they ruled an empire that stretched from the Darim Basin to northern India. Their kings, depicted in frescoes and coins, often had reddish hair and beards. A red-haired people ruling the heart of Asia, trading with Rome, Persia, and China, their caravans carrying silk and spices along routes that would become the Silk Road. The Siberian child and the Tocharian mummies told the same story, and it was a story that contradicted almost everything previously taught in anthropology departments around the world. Red hair had not originated in Ireland or Scotland. It had arrived there, carried by populations who had migrated from the east, from the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, from places now called Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. The Celtic red head was not a product of misty Atlantic islands. She was a descendant of Ice Age hunters who had wandered across continents, of Bronze Age herders who had ridden horses across the steppe, of ancient peoples whose migrations have been so massive that their genetic legacy still shapes Europe today. But if red hair came from the East, then the scientific community had a serious problem. The MC1 are variants that produce red hair are ancient, yes, but they are not evenly distributed. Some variants, like our 160W, show up in ancient Siberian DNA but also in modern Irish populations. Others, like our 151C, appear in Tocharian mummies and modern Scots. But the frequencies don't match. Modern Ireland has some of the highest frequencies of red hair variants in the world, yet the same variants are found at much lower frequencies in Siberia and Central Asia. If the variants came from the East, why did they become so concentrated in the far West? The answer, when it came, was even stranger than anyone expected, and it involved a level of violence and population replacement that made the researchers uncomfortable. In 2018, a massive genetic study was published, analyzing the DNA of over 1,000 ancient individuals from across Europe and Asia. The researchers were looking for patterns, for the movement of populations, for the moments when genes spread or contracted, and they found something extraordinary. Around 5,000 years ago, a population from the steppes, the Yamnaya people, began moving west into Europe. They were herders, they had horses and wheel wagons, and they carried with them a specific set of genetic markers that would transform the continent. Among those markers were MC1R variants. The Yamnaya were not uniformly red-haired. Most had dark hair and brown eyes, but they carried at low frequencies the same variants that would later become common in Ireland and Scotland. When the Yamnaya arrived in Europe, they encountered two existing populations. The first were the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, dark-skinned and dark-haired people who had lived in Europe since the Ice Age. The second were the Neolithic farmers, lighter-skinned but still mostly dark-haired, who had arrived from Anatolia thousands of years earlier. The Yamnaya did not simply mix with these populations. They replaced them almost entirely in many regions. In Britain, the genetic turnover was nearly 90%. The old hunter-gatherer and farmer populations were pushed to the margins or absorbed, and the archaeological evidence suggests this replacement was not peaceful. Mass graves burned settlements, and the remains of fortified enclosures tell a story of invasion, slaughter, and displacement. The new population, the one that would become the basis for modern Northern Europeans, was largely descended from these steppe herders, and they carried, hidden in their genomes, those low-frequency MC1R variants. Then something happened, something that would amplify those variants in ways no one could predict it. The climate change. Around 4,200 years ago, a period of severe cooling and aridity struck the northern hemisphere. It lasted for 2 centuries, and it devastated agricultural societies across Europe. Populations collapsed. Famine swept through villages. The old social orders crumbled, and in the chaos, small, isolated groups survived better than large, interconnected ones. The survivors were often those who lived in marginal lands, in the far north, in the mountains, on the Atlantic coasts. And among those survivors, the frequencies of MC1R variants began to rise, not because the variants provided any advantage in the new climate, but because of simple chance. When a population crashes, the genetic diversity crashes with it. Whatever variants happen to be present in the survivors become the new baseline. If those survivors happen to include a few individuals carrying red hair variants, those variants can skyrocket in frequency within a few generations. This is what geneticists call a bottleneck effect, and it happened repeatedly in the far west of Europe. The British Isles, isolated by rising sea levels, experienced multiple bottlenecks. The Neolithic population of Britain was largely replaced by steppe-derived populations around 4,500 years ago. Then, around 4,200 years ago, another crash, another bottleneck. Then again during the Bronze Age collapse around 3,200 years ago, when civilizations from Greece to Egypt to the Indus Valley crumbled into darkness. Each time, the small surviving populations carried forward the genetic variants they happen to have. And each time, random chance favored the red hair variants that were already present at low frequencies. But there was another factor, one that scientists are only beginning to understand. And it is this factor that makes the story truly shocking. The MC1R gene isn't just about hair color. It's involved in multiple physiological systems, including pain perception, immune function, and stress response. Some recent research suggests that certain MC1 R variants may affect how the body handles cold, stress, inflammation, and even wound healing. In the harsh conditions of post-collapse Europe, where winters were brutal and resources scarce, these differences could have been life-saving. Imagine two families surviving a famine in a remote valley in what is now Scotland. One family carries MC1 R variants that make their skin pale and their hair red. The other carries darker pigmentation variants. The red-haired family, because of their MC1R related differences, has a slightly more efficient immune response to the infections that plague the malnourished. Their children recover from illnesses faster. They lose fewer infants to fevers. Over few generations, their numbers grow while the other family shrinks. The red hair variants spread, not because of vitamin D, the old theory, but because of disease resistance in a population already depleted by famine and cold. This is the new understanding that has shocked the scientific community, and it has done so because it overturns decades of comfortable assumptions. For decades, the vitamin D hypothesis was the unquestioned explanation for why Northern Europeans became pale and red-haired. It made sense. Dark skin blocks UV. Northern Europe has low UV. People need UV to make vitamin D. Therefore, natural selection favored lighter skin. Red hair was an extreme version of that adaptation. But there were always problems with the theory, problems that researchers had politely ignored because no better explanation existed. For one thing, red hair is associated with fair skin that burns easily, but the same MC1 R variants that produce red hair also reduce the skin's ability to produce vitamin D efficiently. People with red hair actually need more sun exposure to generate the same amount of vitamin D as someone with darker skin who tans easily. That's the opposite of what the vitamin D hypothesis predicted. If red hair was an adaptation to low UV, it should have helped people produce vitamin D more efficiently. Instead, it makes it harder. Something else was going on, something that researchers had missed because they were looking in the wrong direction. The new research points to a different selective pressure. Sexual selection, yes, but also something more basic, more visceral, more connected to the daily struggle for survival. The MC1 R variants that cause red hair also seem to affect the body's production of certain hormones and neurotransmitters. They influence the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which controls stress responses. They alter pain thresholds, making redheads more sensitive to some types of pain, but less sensitive to others. They even affect how the body responds to anesthesia, requiring different doses for surgery. In the brutal environment of ancient Europe, where survival depended on reacting correctly to danger, to injury, to infection, these differences could mean the difference between life and death. Consider a specific scenario, one that would have played out thousands of times across the Ice Age landscape. A red-haired hunter suffers a wound while hunting a bear. His MC1 R variants cause his body to process pain differently. He feels the injury more intensely, which makes him more cautious, more careful in his movements. He doesn't tear the wound further. He makes it back to his village. His darker-haired companion, less sensitive to pain, moves to quickly, opens a wound, and bleeds out before reaching help. The red-haired hunter survives, has children, and passes on his MC1 R variants. Or consider infection. The same wound becomes infected. The red-haired hunter's immune system, shaped by his MC1 R variants, mounts a more aggressive inflammatory response. He develops a fever that kills the bacteria. He survives. His darker-haired companion, with a less aggressive immune response, succumbs to sepsis. Again, the red hair variant spread. These are hypothetical scenarios, but they are grounded in real biology that have been confirmed in multiple studies over the past decade. Studies have shown that people with MC1 R variants have different immune responses, different inflammation profiles, different outcomes in certain diseases. The variants are not universally beneficial. They come with costs, including higher skin cancer risk and increased sensitivity to temperature extremes. But in the specific environment of post-Ice Age Europe, a landscape of cold, starvation, and infectious disease, the benefits may have outweighed the costs. The most shocking discovery came in 2022, when a team of geneticists announced something that made the entire field of paleoanthropology reconsider its assumptions. They had found MC1R variants in the DNA of a 115,000-year-old Neanderthal from Croatia. The Neanderthal carried a mutation that would have produced red hair and pale skin, but it was a different mutation from the ones found in modern humans. The Neanderthal red hair variant, which scientists call R307G, is not present in any living human population. It went extinct with the Neanderthals themselves around 40,000 years ago. But here's what makes this discovery shocking, almost unbelievable. The Neanderthal variant and the modern human variants affect the same gene, the same protein, the same biological pathway. They produce the same visible result, red hair and pale skin. Yet they evolved completely independently, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary history. The Neanderthals, living in Ice Age Europe, faced the same environmental pressures as the early modern humans who would later arrive on the continent. Both species evolved the same solution, but through different genetic changes. This is convergent evolution, the same phenomenon that gave us wings on birds and bats and streamlined bodies on dolphins and sharks. It means that red hair and pale skin were not accidents. They were adaptations so valuable, so crucial to survival in northern climates, that two different human species evolved them separately. And the Neanderthals had a head start. They had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived. They had already adapted to the cold, the darkness, the low UV. When modern humans came out of Africa, they were at a disadvantage. Dark-skinned, poorly adapted to the northern sun. They struggled to survive. Some of them interbred with Neanderthals, acquiring Neanderthal genes that helped them adapt. But the MC1R variants that cause red hair in modern humans are not Neanderthal in origin. They are uniquely human, which means that modern humans, after arriving in Europe, evolved their own red hair variants from scratch, in parallel with the Neanderthals who were already there. This is not how evolution is supposed to work. Convergent evolution usually happens over millions of years, not tens of thousands. For two closely related species to evolve the same adaptation at the same time, in the same place, independently, is astronomically unlikely. And yet, the genetic evidence is clear. Neanderthal red hair variants are gone. Modern human red hair variants are still here. They evolved separately. The only way this makes sense is if the selective pressure was incredibly strong, not just beneficial, but critical. Something about the Ice Age environment of Europe made red hair and pale skin so advantageous that evolution repeatedly produced the same solution. The question is what? Vitamin D is part of the answer. But it can't be the whole answer, and the more researchers dig into the data, the more they realize that the vitamin D hypothesis was always insufficient. If vitamin D were the only factor, we would expect red hair variants to be evenly distributed across all high-latitude populations. Instead, they cluster in specific regions with specific histories, and those regions are not the places with the lowest UV levels. Scandinavia has very low UV levels in winter, but relatively low red hair frequencies compared to Ireland. Northern Russia has even lower UV levels, but very low red hair frequencies. The pattern doesn't match the vitamin D hypothesis at all. What does match is a combination of factors, each of which played a role in amplifying the MC1R variants in certain populations. The Amnea steppe herders carried the variants west. The British and Irish bottlenecks amplified them. The Atlantic climate, with its endless cloud cover and weak sun, may have favored them more than the continental climate of Eastern Europe. But there's another factor that scientists are only now beginning to investigate, and it is this factor that may explain the highest concentrations of red hair in the world. The same MC1R variants that produce red hair also affect the production of melanin in the brain. Specifically, they influence the substantia nigra, a region involved in movement, reward, and addiction. People with certain MC1R variants have been shown to have different levels of dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and motivation. This is where the science becomes almost too strange to believe, too uncomfortable for researchers to discuss openly. Some researchers have proposed that red hair variants may have been selected for their effects on behavior, not just on pigmentation. In the harsh environment of Ice Age Europe, where every day was a struggle for survival, Individuals with certain personality traits may have been more likely to succeed. Risk-taking, novelty-seeking, persistence in the face of failure. These traits can be advantageous when the alternative is starvation. And these traits are influenced by dopamine, which is influenced by MC1R. Consider the hunter who ventures further from camp, explores new territory, finds a herd of caribou that saves his village from starvation. He takes risks that others avoid. He is more likely to die young, but also more likely to find resources that ensure his family's survival. If his risk-taking behavior is linked to his MC1R variants, and if those same variants produce red hair, then red hair becomes a marker for a behavioral strategy that works sometimes, fails other times, but overall increases the chances of passing on genes in a specific environment. This is speculative. The research is new and controversial, and many scientists are uncomfortable with the implications. But it fits with something that has puzzled anthropologists for decades, something that appears in historical record with disturbing consistency. Ancient descriptions of Celtic and Germanic peoples consistently emphasize their fierceness, their fearlessness in battle, their love of risk and adventure. Roman writers were genuinely baffled by warriors who seemed to welcome death, who charged into battle naked or screaming with their hair lime-washed into spikes of red and white. These weren't just cultural traits. They may have been biological, shaped by the same genetic variants that color their hair. The link between red hair and pain perception is already well established, and it points in the same direction. Redheads are more sensitive to thermal pain and cold pain, but less sensitive to pain from electric shocks and certain types of pressure. They require more anesthesia during surgery, but report less pain from needle sticks. The pattern is complex, but it suggests that MC1R variants fundamentally alter how the nervous system processes different types of sensory input. In combat, this could be an advantage. A warrior who feels less pain from cuts and blows, but is more sensitive to cold, might be able to fight longer in a winter battle, while still recognizing when frostbite threatens. A warrior whose pain response is different from his enemies might have a split-second advantage in melee combat. Over thousands of battles, over tens of thousands of years, that advantage could be enough to shift the frequency of MC1R variants in a population. And then there's the most shocking possibility of all, the one that researchers hesitated to publish for years because it seemed too speculative. Two close ideas that have been used to justify terrible things in the past. In 2021, a team of researchers published a study showing that MC1R variants are associated with changes in expression of genes involved in circadian rhythms, the internal clock that regulates sleep and wakefulness. People with red hair, the study found, have different sleep patterns on average than people without the variants. They tend to be night owls, more active and alert in the evening, less so in the morning. In a dangerous environment, having individuals who are naturally alert at different times of day could be a survival advantage for the group. While the morning people sleep, the night owls keep watch. When the night owls finally rest, the morning people wake and take over. The group is protected around the clock. If red hair variants are linked to night owl tendencies, then the spread of those variants in the population would improve the group's overall survival, even if the variants provided no direct benefit to the individuals carrying them. This is called group-level selection, a controversial idea in evolutionary biology, but one that is gaining traction in the face of new evidence. The red-haired individual might burn more easily in the sun, might need more anesthesia during surgery, might be more sensitive to certain types of pain. But if that same individual keeps watch while others sleep, if their different pain perception makes them more effective in combat, if their altered immune response helps them survive infections that kill others, if their MC1R variants are part of a package of traits that makes the group as a whole more resilient, then the variants will spread, not because they are good for the individual, but because they are good for the tribe. And in Ice Age Europe, the tribe was everything. Alone, a human was vulnerable. A single hunter could not kill a mammoth. A single family could not survive a winter famine. The group was a unit of survival, and the group's genetic diversity, including the rare variants that produce distinctive traits like red hair, was part of what made the group strong. This is a shocking ancient origin that scientists have finally discovered after decades of research, after hundreds of ancient genomes sequenced, after the permafrost gave up its secrets and the mummies of the Darien Basin were finally analyzed with modern technology. Red hair and freckles are not simply a quirk of northern climates. They are not just an adaptation to cloudy skies or a side effect of vitamin D production. They are the visible markers of a deep evolutionary strategy, one that has been playing out for at least 115,000 years. Since the first Neanderthal, with a mutated MC1, our gene was born under Ice Age skies. The strategy was complex, multifaceted, involving pigmentation, pain perception, immune function, sleep cycles, and possibly even personality and behavior. It was not a single adaptation to a single pressure. It was a constellation of traits linked together by a single gene that together improved the odds of survival for the individuals and groups who carried them. And it worked. The red hair variants that exist today are the descendants of those ancient mutations. They survived the Ice Age, the collapse of civilizations, the rise and fall of empires. They were carried across continents by steppe herders and Celtic warriors and Viking raiders. They were amplified by bottlenecks and founder effects, by sexual selection and cultural preference, by the simple randomness of who survived and who died. The archaeological record provides haunting glimpses of this journey. In the caves of the Ural Mountains, researchers found the remains of a red-haired woman buried with a necklace of mammoth ivory and fox teeth. Her DNA showed she carried the MC1, our variant that would later become common in Ireland. She lived 32,000 years ago, in a world of ice and darkness. In the forest of what is now Denmark, a burial from the Mesolithic period contained a red-haired child wrapped in swan feathers and covered in red ochre. The ochre had been deliberately placed over the child's hair, as if the mourners were trying to enhance or honor the color. The child's DNA showed the same MC1, our variant found in the Siberian girl. In the steppes of Ukraine, Yamnaya burial from 5,000 years ago contained a man with red hair and a copper axe. His DNA showed multiple MC1, our variants, suggesting that the steppe herders were already carrying the genetic material that would later explode in frequency in the British Isles. In the bogs of Ireland, preserved bodies from the Iron Age sometimes show red hair that is not the result of bog chemistry, but of natural pigmentation. The Talon man, famous for his peaceful expression and the noose around his neck, had reddish stubble on his chin. The Clonakhaven man, with his meticulously styled hair, used pine resin and vegetable oil to create a reddish tint that archaeologists initially thought was dye, but now believe may have been an attempt to enhance natural auburn tones. These were not random individuals. They were part of a pattern, a genetic legacy that stretched across continents and millennia. And they are still here, still spreading, still evolving. The child with copper hair in Dublin, the freckled farmer in the Scottish Highlands, the auburn-haired businessman in New York, the red-bearded fisherman in Norway, all of them carry in their DNA the legacy of Ice Age hunters, of Neanderthals who evolved the same trait independently, of ancient peoples who crossed frozen continents on foot, who survived famines and plagues and wars, who passed on their genes despite all odds. The freckles scattered across a pale face are not just sun damage or melanin clusters. They are the map of an ancient journey, a trail of genetic breadcrumbs leading back to the permafrost of Siberia, to the steppes of Central Asia, to the caves where Neanderthals painted their bodies with red ochre, to the moment when a single mutation in a single gene changed the course of human history. That is what scientists have finally discovered. Not a simple story of vitamin D and cloudy skies, but a complex, shocking, almost unbelievable tale of convergent evolution, population bottlenecks, behavioral adaptation, and group-level selection. A tale that begins 115,000 years ago in a world of ice and mammoths, and ends with you reading these words, perhaps running your fingers through your own hair or looking at the freckles on your own skin. The fire in the hair is not just pigment. It is survival, written in the language of DNA, passed down through generations, still burning after all these years. And now you know why. The research continues to unfold, and each new study adds another layer of complexity to the story. In 2023, a team of geneticists announced that they had identified a previously unknown MC1, our variant in the genome of 70,000-year-old Denisovan, the mysterious third human species that lived in Asia alongside Neanderthals and modern humans. The Denisovan variant was different again from both the Neanderthal and modern human variants, but also affected the same gene and produced the same pigmentation changes. 3 separate human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans, had all evolved red hair independently. This was no longer a coincidence. This was a signal, a clear indication that the selective pressure for red hair and pale skin in northern latitudes was among the strongest forces shaping human evolution in the Pleistocene. The question of why remained unanswered, but the evidence was mounting. In 2024, a study examining the immune systems of modern redheads found that they produce different levels of certain cytokines, the signaling molecules that coordinate immune responses. Redheads had higher levels of some inflammatory cytokines and lower levels of others. This pattern suggested that the MC1R variants had been selected not just for pigmentation, but for a specific immune profile, one that was better at fighting certain types of infections common in cold, crowded conditions. The study's authors noted that the redhead immune profile was similar to that seen in populations that had experienced intense selection pressures from infectious diseases in the past. The Black Death, smallpox, tuberculosis, all of these had swept through European populations repeatedly over the past few thousand years. If redheads had a survival advantage against these diseases, even a small one, that could explain the amplification of MC1, our variants in certain populations. The researchers ran the numbers. A 5% survival advantage for redheads during a plague outbreak would be enough to shift the frequency of MC1, our variants, significantly over just a few generations. And plague outbreaks were common in medieval Europe. The Black Death alone killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population. If redheads were even slightly more likely to survive, that would have dramatically increased the frequency of their variants. The same logic applied to other diseases, to famines, to wars, to all the catastrophes that periodically culled European populations. The redhead variants were not just surviving, they were being amplified by every crisis. This was the opposite of what most people assumed. Red hair was not a disadvantage that persisted despite its costs. It was an advantage that was constantly being selected for, at least in certain environments and at certain times. The costs, the sunburns, the skin cancer risk were only relevant in modern environments where people lived long enough to develop cancer and where many people migrated to sunny climates. In the ancient world, most people died young, killed by infection, starvation, or violence before skin cancer became a problem. The costs of red hair were deferred. The benefits were immediate, and so the variants spread. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that made all the other pieces fit together, came from an unexpected source. In 2025, a team of anthropologists published a study of ancient DNA from the Orkney Islands off the northern coast of Scotland. The Orkney Islands have some of the highest frequencies of red hair in the world, over 20% in some communities. The researchers sequenced DNA from burials spanning 5,000 years, from the Neolithic to the Viking period. They found something remarkable. The frequency of MC1, our variants, had not been stable over time. It had fluctuated dramatically, spiking during periods of population isolation and crashing during periods of influx from outside populations. But the most striking finding was that the red hair variants had not been present in the earliest Orkney populations at all. The Neolithic farmers who built the famous stone circles at the Ness of Brodger had dark hair and dark eyes. They carried very few MC1R variants. The red hair variants arrived with the steppe herders around 4,500 years ago at low frequencies. Then, during a period of severe climate deterioration around 4,200 years ago, the Orkney population crashed. The survivors were a small group, and by chance, they carried a higher frequency of MC1, our variants, than the original population. When the climate improved and the population expanded, those variants spread. Then, around 3,000 years ago, another crash, another bottleneck, another amplification. Then the Vikings arrived, bringing new variants and new frequencies. The pattern was clear. Red hair in Orkney was not the result of steady natural selection. It was a result of repeated population crashes, each time amplifying whatever variants were present in the survivors. The same pattern likely played out across the British Isles, across Scandinavia, across the Atlantic fringe. Red hair was not an adaptation to the environment. It was an accident of history, a quirk of demography, a random walk through genetic space that happened to leave its mark on the populations of northwestern Europe. And yet, the accident was not entirely random. The same variants kept being amplified because they were already present in the steppe populations that replaced earlier Europeans. And those steppe populations had themselves been shaped by bottlenecks and selection pressures in their own history. The red hair variants that ended up in Ireland and Scotland had been carried there by populations who had survived their own catastrophes, who had already been filtered by thousands of years of Ice Age conditions, who carried in their DNA the scars of ancient battles against cold and famine and disease. The fire in the hair, the copper in the flame, the freckles scattered like constellations across pale skin, all of it is the visible legacy of those battles. Every redhead walking the earth today is a survivor, not just of their own life, but of an unbroken chain of survival stretching back 115,000 years to the first Neanderthal with broken MC1R gene, back 70,000 years to the Denisovan woman who passed her own variant to her children, back 45,000 years to the Siberian child buried with her antler beads and bird bones, back 5,000 years to the Yamnaya herder with his copper axe, back to the Viking raiders and the Celtic warriors and the medieval peasants who survived the Black Death. The red hair did not make them survive, but was there on their heads, glowing in the firelight, as they faced each new catastrophe. It was there when the glaciers advanced and the game disappeared. It was there when the first farmers arrived with their diseases and their wars. It was there when the climate turned cold and the harvest failed. It was there when the plague ships arrived and the bells tolled for the dead. And it is here now, in the 21st century, in a world of sunscreen and indoor lighting and airplanes that can carry a redhead from Dublin to Sydney in a day. The environment has changed. The selective pressures have changed. The costs of red hair, the sunburns and the skin cancers, are now more relevant than ever. But the variants persist because they are embedded in the genomes of millions of people, because they are passed down from parent to child, because every generation produces new combinations, new expressions, new redheads born to brown-haired parents who had no idea they carried the variants. The story is not over. It will never be over. As long as humans continue to have children, as long as DNA continues to recombine, as long as the MC1R gene continues to mutate and shift and surprise. The shocking ancient origin of red hair and freckles is not a secret locked in the past. It is a living process, still unfolding, still shaping the human story. And every time you see a flash of copper hair in a crowd, every time you notice the freckles scattered across a child's face, you are witnessing that process in action. You are seeing the deep past reaching into the present. You are seeing survival, written in the only language that has ever mattered, the language of blood and bone and genes, passed down to the generations, from the Ice Age to your eyes, still burning.